All right, hello and welcome to another criminal law capsule. And today I'm going to be talking about something referred to in the law as the common sense inference. It is a way of proving a particular state of mind, and it is something that causes a fair bit of difficulty, especially for law students when they are starting out their inquiry into the criminal law. So I really want to focus on how the common sense inference works, and in particular what you really want to avoid either in writing an exam, writing a paper, or even when you get to court, because mistakes surrounding the common sense inference are fairly prevalent all through the court system. So you really want to have an idea of how the common sense inference works. Now let's start with a key point relating to the common sense inference, CSI, not to be confused, of course, with the television show. It relates very directly to the notion of subjective foresight, which is an important mens rea element. And subjective foresight, or crimes requiring subjective foresight, are all over the criminal code. It's the default presumption that where there is no specified state of mind required, the common law infers that subjective foresight, meaning intention or recklessness, are required. And what I mean by that, let's put that into concrete terms. Let's just take the crime of murder, for example. So when you're dealing with murder, you can, try to assess, well, what is the state of mind that is required to prove murder? Well, murder, I'm not going to go through every definition, but basically what it requires is an intention to cause the prohibited consequence, which is death. There are some other definitions, but it really doesn't matter for what we're doing here. So murder requires an intention to prove death, which is a subjective state of mind. And this subjective state of mind, as you know, is assessed based on what the accused actually was intending to do. And that's really, really important. Subjective state of minds rest on the basic idea that you can't convict somebody of a crime, this particular crime, unless they actually intended to cause the death. The moral responsibility for the crime really stems in large part from the mens rea that is required. Now, if you've been studying criminal law for a while now, you will know that while subjective foresight of consequences is the preeminent form of attributing liability, there are crimes for which objective foresight is enough. And let's just consider one: assault causing bodily harm. For reasons I could deal with in another podcast, the law has accepted that for certain types of acts, subjective foresight of consequences is not required, and assault causing bodily harm is one of them. Essentially, the mens rea of assault causing bodily harm is the basic mens rea for assault, which is an intention to apply force with knowledge of a lack of consent. That is the mens rea, and the court has essentially decided that that is a sufficient blameworthy state to impose liability, and therefore you do not need proof that the person intended the consequences. So the way it works is, for mens rea, only require what is called objective foresight of consequences, which means that a reasonable person would foresee that your act, the assault, would cause bodily harm. That's it. And this is very different. So let's take a look at how this works in a little bit more detail. With subjective foresight, what you are looking for is that the accused intended the consequences or was reckless towards them, depending upon the definition for that particular crime. But the focus is always on what did the accused think? And therefore, as is often said, if you have a stupid accused or accused who's just distracted or uneducated or even, as you'll see later on, in some cases drunk, in any case where they can show that they lacked subjective foresight, so they didn't foresee that the consequence was going to occur or, for recklessness, was probably going to occur, that mandates an acquittal. But objective foresight is different. Objective foresight exists as a way of protecting the accused from completely unforeseeable results. So where assault causing bodily harm takes place, the court will hold you liable if you have the mens rea subjectively for the assault, and that is subjective. It's stated in the code that you have to intentionally apply force, and the case law makes clear that the lack of consent has to be known to you or you were reckless regarding it. So there's your subjective mens rea. But with causing bodily harm, the court does not require a subjective mens rea component for the reasons I expressed earlier. But they do require an objective component. And the reason for that is essentially to ensure that the accused isn't convicted of a crime when no reasonable person could foresee that the harm would occur. So let's say I walk up to somebody and I just slap them on the back, let's say. So I give them a slap. And for the moment, let's say they didn't consent to that. So I've got the mens rea, I slapped them. And I've got the mens rea, and potentially I could be convicted of assault. I intentionally applied force without consent and without knowledge of consent. But let's assume for the moment that unbeknownst to me or any reasonable person, that person suffers from severe brittle bones. It's a regular healthy person, but I break 3 of their ribs with a light slap to the back. The basic idea is that the mens rea acts as a way of preventing me from being convicted for the superior offense of assault causing bodily harm. I may be guilty of the assault, but I did not commit the assault causing bodily harm because a reasonable person would not have foreseen the injury. Keep in mind that a reasonable person is an objective standard, and it is not really focused on my personal perception of consequences. To be clear, it will take the facts based on what I knew, so they will see, well, you went up to a guy and hit him on the back, but at the end of the day, the only question that remains is whether a reasonable person would foresee. Now, the example that I've given you is a situation in which the reasonable person standard protects the accused from being convicted, if the alternative was that there was no mens rea required at all, because that was an option available to the courts, and they might just say, well, anytime you cause harm, you're guilty. The reasonable person standard is a protection, but it also is a way of attributing liability in situations where I can say, well, I didn't think they would be harmed, and I certainly did not intend to harm them. Court says, too bad. If a reasonable person would have known that what you were going to do was going to cause harm, bodily harm, you are guilty of the offense. So the reasonable person standard is a way of attributing liability in situations where the court does not require subjective proofs of consequences. Another great example of that is manslaughter. Manslaughter is regarded as the situation in which you kill someone but you didn't intend for them to die. And that is, of course, murder, if you intended for them to die. Manslaughter punishes people who commit an unlawful act like an assault, but did not have subjective foresight of death. All that's required in that situation is objective foresight of bodily harm, believe it or not, but that's a subject for another capsule. So the reasonable person standard, very different from the subjective standard. With that backdrop, let's get back to the common sense inference. And as I said, it is connected directly to the idea of subjective foresight. How? Well, when you need to prove subjective foresight, the biggest question that you're left with in most trials, I mean, in some cases, you can obviously have a person who confessed, yes, I intended to kill them. That's good evidence of subjective foresight. Let's assume you don't have that. How do you prove that a person subjectively intended the consequences of their actions? And that is where the common sense inference comes in. It is simply a means by which we attempt to prove subjective foresight. How do we do that? We use basic inference reasoning. And that's really what it is. The common sense inference is simply an evidentiary deduction based on what is available in the case. And it's based on the idea that we draw the most logical conclusion from an act. And that is that where a person commits an act, let's say in my murder case, shooting a gun, they can say all day they didn't intend to kill the person, but generally speaking, we assume that a person intends the consequences of their action. And that is simply based on an inference. It's based on logic. In reasonable circumstances, we can assume that a person intends the consequences of what their action is. That's a logical thing. Most people do things and they do what they say. But it is important to keep in mind that the common sense inference is just that. It is an inference that is not mandatory. It is simply available. And you draw it or don't draw it based on all the circumstances in the case. So the way the common sense inference works is as follows. Where a person commits an act, we assess whether a reasonable person would know that consequences in that circumstance would follow. But I can't stress strongly enough. This is very different from objective foresight that I just discussed, because this is simply a permissive, notice the dashed lines, inference as a means of helping you find that the accused subjectively knew. That's all it is. It is nothing more and nothing less than an evidentiary inference. It is not a particular mental state, and it is not something you can draw in every case. Now, what I think drives students crazy is that the common sense inference looks a lot like objective foresight, but it is not the same thing. These are not equal. A common sense inference simply says to you that you decide whether or not a reasonable person would know the consequences, and if you conclude yes, they would, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, you can draw the inference that the accused knew. And you need to take great care both in applying the common sense inference and, more important to law students, in describing it. Where you go wrong is when you start to use this not as a helpful tool, but as a mandatory device. And let me show you what I mean. Well, what you always want to do when you're describing the common sense inference is make very clear that it's very different from what we do when we have objective foresight. So, with subjective foresight, what we're looking for, you can use the common sense inference as a way of determining whether the accused knew or was reckless or whatever. But at the end of the day, what you have to describe is that the ultimate decision is based on the accused's state of mind. So you can use the common sense inference as a way of coming to that conclusion, but you've got to consider all the evidence. So if the accused says, I didn't intend this, you can assess that evidence by looking at what a reasonable person would have done. Well, I didn't intend to kill anybody. I really didn't. But you were shooting a guy from 2 feet away and you shot him in the head. Seems to me that a reasonable person would know that if you shoot somebody in the head, they're going to die. So I don't believe you, accused. The common sense inference is a way of, as I said, disbelieving evidence of the accused or reaching a conclusion in the absence of any evidence about intent. But I cannot stress enough, if you do not filter this inquiry through the accused's subjective perception, you will go wrong. And I can't tell you how many cases I've seen where judges slip. They slip all the time. They start talking about reasonable person, what a reasonable person would think, and forgot to mention that at the end of the day you must be absolutely convinced, notwithstanding reasonable person analogies, that that was what the accused thought. The objective foresight inquiry is completely different, and that's why it's so handy when it's in play. All you're trying to show is what a reasonable person would have done. You don't care what the accused would have done. So even though the reasonable person inquiry for objective foresight may in some ways look a little bit like, right, this common sense inference up here, it's really very different. I don't need to find that the accused knew. I don't need to disbelieve what the accused said. The accused can get up and say, I didn't do it, I didn't mean to do it, I didn't mean to cause bodily harm. And you know what? Who cares? I mean, you'll listen to that evidence, but at the end of the day, the only question with an objective foresight inquiry is, would a reasonable person have known? That's all you're looking at. The common sense inference, while it does sort of similar things, because you're using that same line of reasoning to decide what a reasonable person would have foreseen, is ultimately very different, because it is filtered through the accused's perception and must, at the end of the day, prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused actually knew, foresaw, or was reckless, depending on the particular crime the accused has been charged with. A little bit confusing, a little bit complicated, takes a little while for students, especially when they're starting out, to wrap their head around it. But I cannot stress enough how important it is to keep these two inquiries separated. If you don't do that, you're eventually going to go down the road and start expressing yourself in the mindset of the reasonable person, and that is where you get in trouble. In any event, I hope this capsule was helpful to spell out how the common sense inference works and what you never want to do with it. And have a great day.